It's lovely to see you all. Hi, Kate, Jenny, Lorraine, Paula. Great stuff. Well, in the spirit of what we've been doing in the past on these, I think we'll get going right on time. So welcome everybody to Bradfield in Conversation. Tonight we have for you Hearts and Minds for Climate Action. I'm Dr. Samantha Graham, President of Voices of Bradfield, and on behalf of the Executive Committee, Stuart, Carolyn, Gillian, Rob, Kate and myself, many of whom you can see on here already, some are waving. We're really delighted to welcome you, residents of Bradfield and those from further afield, to an evening, this time with Professor Lesley Hughes and Dr. Fiona Foo. We'll get to their details shortly. Just briefly, Voices of Bradfield, as many of you know, is an independent community organisation, and we're united by our shared purpose in returning respect, integrity and trust to politics. We are urgently and somewhat joyfully, as best we can, building a voice in our democracy for the people of Bradfield. There's this smell of an oily rag involved there, and a lot of goodwill and a lot of people coming on board very, very quickly, which is fabulous. Two things before we begin. We're recording this for future use. Thanks to Lesley and Fiona for okaying that. And if Gillian is there, I would love to turn to Gillian. Is she there? To do the acknowledgement of country. And if not, we will hold the acknowledgement of country in our hearts.
Carolyn, can
and I will share my screen just to show you one of the works that we tend to use when we do our acknowledgement of country. Here we go. So, Stuart and Carolyn, do you want to nod if you can see my Gabriella Possum image? Thank you very much. Yes, so I am not that well versed at doing acknowledgement of country. I'm not sure where Gillian is, but we would like to honour the original owners and custodians of this land, leaders past, present and future, as we sit in this wonderful country of ours, in our various places of our various connections to country, and in particular Bradfield being represented by
Darug and Garangai.
Oh, let me share this screen. Bradfield. Ooh, where are we? In a more Western version of understanding, by this area here, which is, as you can see, yes, people are leaning in to check if they're in the suburb or not, perhaps. So up in the north Turramurra, Asquith, etc., and out on the west side, Waitara, Normanhurst, South Turramurra, and then down the very southeastern tip, Castle Cove, Roseville, Linfield, down the south there. So that is our geographical location. So with no further ado, and with plenty of people jumping on board here, which is lovely to see, let's get going. So Professor Lesley Hughes and Dr. Fiona Foo, basically following the release of the latest Ipcc report and the UN declaring Code Red for humanity, Professor Lesley Hughes and Dr. Fiona Foo bring their hearts and minds to Voices of Bradfield's informed panel discussion. Now, I thought the title was very clever. I did not think of it, partly because when we're talking about hearts, we're talking about Dr. Fiona Foo, who is a highly experienced interventional cardiologist working with Sydney Cardiology Group and Macquarie Health Cardiology. She's a VMO in Sydney Adventist, Macquarie University and Norwest Hospitals. And she also has interests in women and heart disease, climate change and cardiovascular disease, and sports cardiology. So the heart is well taken care of. And she's partaken in regular pro bono work in the developing world. Alongside her this evening, we've got Professor Lesley Hughes, a distinguished professor of biology and Pro Vice Chancellor, Research, Integrity and Development. She is an ecologist whose main research interest has been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems and the implications of climate change for conservation. She's a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment reports, a former federal climate commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. She's also a director for WWF Australia and a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. So at this point, I would definitely like to point out the clapping buttons, which I know you're probably all familiar with, but if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the little reaction smiley, and you can click on that. And I, for instance, am now doing a little, whatever that is called, celebration that you're all here and that Lesley and Fiona have given their time and energy to join us. So have a go with that. Yes, everybody's clapping. Great, you've got it. Very good. We've also got the chat bar, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And Stuart and a number of the team will be checking the chat bar and alerting me to things if I miss them, because a lot of stuff can fly by there. But that's where we'll collect questions and address them towards the end. So put those questions in there. Okay. So we have 3 questions that we're posing to our esteemed panelists this evening. And the first one is really to set the scene. It's probably been a long day for a lot of you. A lot of you have been on Zooms all day or doing the grind, and it hasn't been that joyful. And I'm sorry, this first question is a little bit on the dark side. It will improve. To set the scene, we've asked them to give us the bad news straight up. So the impacts that our guests are observing on ecosystems and human health, on policy and the absence of policy, what are they seeing in their professional experience? So a lot of this we've discussed in a prep meeting, but I didn't ask who wants to go first. So Lesley, Fiona, which of you would like to go first?
I'm happy to go
think
first,
Lesley should go first,
because
yeah.
I think I can lead into Fiona's presentation, if that makes sense to you, Fiona.
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect. So you go for it, Lesley. I'll give you the screen.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm coming to you from Wallumattagal land of the Darug Nation, and I also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to share my screen now. And as Sam just said, I'm going to give you the bad news first. And what I'm actually going to give you is a very, very quick rundown of the IPCC report, what it's found, what it means, and what Australia actually needs to do. So I'm hoping that will provoke lots of discussion. So the latest IPCC report was released about 3 weeks ago, and the tagline is that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. I'm going to give you the top line messages. Firstly, the IPCC report finds that the scale and pace at which humans are changing the climate system has almost no precedent. That is in the 4.5 billion year history of the planet, and that the impacts of this change are accelerating. Our oceans are absorbing about a bit over 90% of the excess heat in the Earth system, and there is now actually about double the amount of heat being trapped in the atmosphere than there was prior to 2005. We can detect warming down to a depth of 2 kilometres, and the oceans are also absorbing a lot of that extra CO2, but that's making seawater more acid, and our oceans are now 30% more acid than they were in pre-industrial times. Glaciers are retreating all over the world and will continue to do so for many decades hence. And the problem with that is that glaciers are actually a really important source of fresh water to about 1/6 of the world's population. The polar ice caps are melting, and melting very fast. In fact, at a rate now about 4 times that of the past decade compared to the 1990s. Sea level rise as a result of all that melting ice and as a result of the oceans being warmer, which occupies more volume, is accelerating. And the rate of sea level rise in the past decade is about doubled compared to that over the previous 4 decades. Our cyclones are becoming more severe. There is now serious need for a category 6 for cyclones. And extreme heat and heat waves are increasing, with 2020 being globally the hottest year on record and the past 7 years being the hottest 7 on record. In Australia, 2019 was our hottest year, and Australia's actually warmed over 1.4 degrees since 1910 when records began. And in 2019, there were 3 times the number of extreme hot days in that year as in any year in the previous century. And poor old Penrith, not in Bradfield, but not that far away, in 2020 in January, Penrith had the distinction of being the hottest place on earth at nearly 49 degrees. Frequency of extreme events is increasing. That last bar on this graph is 2019. And extreme heat and heat waves kill more Australians than any other weather-related event combined. And Fiona will be talking more about health impacts. The water cycle is intensifying. That is, dry areas are getting drier and more drought-stricken. Wet areas are getting wetter. And when it does rain, it's coming down in more intense bursts, and that causes flooding. 2019 was not only the hottest year in Australia, but also the driest year on record, with rainfall 40% below average. And that set up the perfect conditions for the bushfire season that we all experienced. Bushfire seasons in general are lengthening up to 2 months and becoming more severe in Australia. And those black summer bushfires, which actually started in the wintertime, burnt 18 million hectares, and that's about 3 times the size of Tasmania. So these worsening impacts of climate change are actually baked into the climate system for at least the next 2 decades. What that means is that things will get worse before they get better, even after we get emissions under control. We're likely to hit that 1.5 degree target globally by the early 2030s. And this is what we can expect going ahead in Australia. So heat waves and fire risk increasing, more marine heat waves causing ocean coral bleaching, more extreme rainfall, sea levels will continue to rise, the severity of cyclones will continue to increase, and we'll be getting more droughts. I told you this was the bad news first. Another key finding of the report is that catastrophic events, sometimes called tipping points, cannot be ruled out in the future. These are some of those sorts of events. Conversion, for example, of the Amazon rainforest from being a storage place for carbon to being a source for carbon. Melting of the permafrost, putting more carbon dioxide, methane into the atmosphere. Ongoing melting of the Arctic sea ice and glaciers, and ongoing loss of coral reefs. And this is really the most important finding of all, that the window for effective action on climate change is still there, but it's closing rapidly. But because it's still there, that means that the climate future is still in our hands. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement, incredibly important international framework for action, aims to keep temperatures globally well below 2 degrees and aspires to keep them below 1.5. Unfortunately, the pledges to Paris thus far will actually lead to a 3-degree warming, even if they're met on time 100%. The world has warmed 1.2 degrees so far, so you can only imagine what a 3-degree warming might be. Now, we know from a little technique called the carbon budget what we need to do. So I'll be very brief here, but we can use this little formula which relates the amount of carbon in the atmosphere to the temperature of the atmosphere to ask a question like this: will we meet the 1.5 degree target? Based on current emissions rates, we will spend, that is, emit all the carbon for that target 2.5 years from now. And so to stay 1.5 below 1.5, we actually need to multiply all the Paris pledges globally by about 5 times. We can ask the same question: will we meet the below 2 degrees target? We will expend the carbon budget for 2 degrees at the present rate in 9.5 years from now. So by 2030, in order to stay well below 2 degrees, we actually need to multiply our Paris pledges by 3. To stay, once again, well below 2 degrees, we actually have to halve global emissions by 2030. We need to be at net zero by 2040 and 2050, which is talked about a lot these days, for net zero is a decade too late. We've waited too long. Now, Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, who came up with that code red for humanity, said this the other day. A target of net zero by 2050 emissions to address the climate emergency is an illusion. Net zero must be in the next decade. There must be no new coal plants built after 2020. OECD countries, that includes Australia, must phase out existing coal by 2030, with all our others following suit by 2040. This is a problem for Australia because we are the world's largest exporter of coal, with nearly 30% of global trade. We're the second largest exporter of thermal coal, which is what we make electricity out of. And if we add gas into that mix, we are the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. The Australian government last year spent $10.3 billion of our taxpayers' money on fossil fuel subsidies, propping up the fossil fuel industry. Now, the UN judges the world's countries by how well they're meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And the last report that came out said that Australia was about 35 out of the 165 countries that are trying to meet the goals. Not too bad, but not too great. But it's this goal number 13 that's the critical one for this conversation. That's the climate policy. The UN ranked Australia last out of more than 200 countries on climate policy and climate action. Last report, we were second last, just ahead of Brunei. We are now last. So if any politician says that we're doing good things on climate, they're actually lying. The Climate Council published this report last March where we calculated that Australia's fair share of global emissions reduction is to reduce our emissions 75%. That's triple our current ambition compared to 2005 levels by 2030. And to do our global fair share, we need to reach net zero by 2035. So my final messages. We are in a climate emergency. It's a fact, not just a slogan. We are seeing our physical and biological world transforming before our eyes, and we don't have much time to turn this around. Every fraction of a degree of warming is doing us harm, and every further fraction of a degree will do us more harm. That means that every year that we delay getting on top of this situation really matters, and that means that every one of our choices matters. Climate change is happening as a result of billions and billions of not so good choices. So what we need to do now is make much better ones. I'll leave it there and pass it back to Fiona. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Lesley. Just before we go on to you, Fiona, can everybody just still make sure they're still in their body? Yes, there's a clap from George. Thank you. Many claps. It's such hard data to hear, and we need to hear it. So God bless all of you for turning up tonight. I really appreciate it. And I think, you know, that's why we're here. We have to hear this stuff. Do just make sure you're in your body. It is easy to sort of just disappear. I know you might pour yourself another glass of wine or grab that cup of tea and just, you know, we need to simultaneously hear this stuff and give ourselves comfort and look around the Zoom room and go, okay, I'm not alone here. This is my tribe. So thank you for that, Lesley. And Fiona, over to you.
Unmute.
There you are.
Okay,
Great.
so I'll just go on slide show. Okay, can we all see this? Yep.
Perfect.
You can hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So Lesley's talked about the implications of climate change. So rising sea levels, increasing CO2 levels, rising temperatures, extreme weather causes all these other effects here. But this leads to a number of human health effects, including cardiovascular disease, heat-related illness and death, mental health impacts, asthma and other respiratory diseases, a number of infectious diseases, other respiratory diseases, malnutrition, and we've got mental health impacts again. But essentially, there's a lot of health impacts, and I'm going to be talking about mainly the cardiovascular ones. And I know we're probably sick of hearing about the coronavirus pandemic, But, there is also evidence that this is not going to be our last pandemic. Unfortunately, we are probably going to face more pandemics, and this is partly as a result of climate change as well. So why am I talking about climate change and cardiovascular disease? Well, cardiovascular disease is already one of the leading causes of death in Australia. And climate change, through its association with extreme weather events, particularly heat and air pollution, increases cardiovascular deaths and morbidity. So if we look at climate change causing global warming, heat events, and air pollution, particularly in the vulnerable, so the elderly, those with low socioeconomic status, as well as people with comorbidities such as diabetes and hypertension, they're going to be more vulnerable. But I think the other important thing to remember is that it affects everyone. So the environment is a modifiable risk factor. And people who probably know about what we call modifiable risk factors for heart disease, and then non-modifiable risk factors. So things like smoking, having high cholesterol, having diabetes, these all increase the risk of heart disease. But air pollution comes up number 4. So it's higher than smoking, higher than fasting sugar levels, higher than alcohol and being sedentary. And even non-optimal temperature is another environmental risk factors, but it's described as a modifiable risk factor. And Lesley talked about Australia getting hotter, so I won't go into this, but heat, and Lesley said this as well, heat is one of the greatest weather-related causes of death. And it might surprise you that actually dying from a cardiovascular event is the primary cause of death during heat waves. But it also increases ED visits and hospital admissions, increased deaths from respiratory and other diseases, mental health issues, and adverse pregnancy outcomes. And these are all expected to increase as climate change progresses, because it's the risks are associated with higher degrees of global warming. And again, the elderly, and I'm not saying more than 65 is elderly, but the older people, people with cardiorespiratory and other chronic diseases, and very young children are particularly vulnerable, but it affects everyone. So there's been a lot of publications that show that heat and extreme heat and heat waves increase cardiovascular deaths. It increases something called ischemic heart disease. And sorry for my abbreviations, but ischemic heart disease is essentially heart attacks and heart artery disease. It also increases stroke and heart failure deaths, and it increases hospitalizations for all cardiovascular disease and out of hospital cardiac arrest. So the risks are greater for more intense heat waves, and will increase the greater the temperature rise. And we'll expect more of this to happen because we're getting more intense heat waves and increasing temperatures. And there's also something called an urban heat island effect. So where people in rural areas are more vulnerable to the risk of heat-related death than those living more rurally. And 90% of Australians actually live in an urban area. So the other big one is air pollution. So air pollution, I'll just quickly talk about, is composed of something called particulate matter, or PM, and gaseous components and semi-volatile liquids. So PM are these tiny particulate matters, and they're described according to their size. So for example, PM10, less than 10 microns, PM2.5 is less than 2.5 microns. And this is the size of a human hair, and this is the size of a beach sand. So they're tiny. And so the importance of that, and the sources of PM include things like fossil fuel burning industry, agricultural burning, but also motor vehicles, airplanes, residential wood fires, as well as forest fires. But the importance of this PM is that, so whilst PM10 can go into the lungs, PM2.5 can go and pass into the lungs and also into the bloodstream. And there are a lot of health risks of particulate matter. You might think it might just be respiratory, but there's a lot of heart issues, so heart attacks and heart rhythm problems. And so people with underlying heart or lung conditions, children and pregnant women and older adults are more vulnerable. But if you look at this, it's not only heart disease and respiratory disease and adverse pregnancy outcomes that are increased because of air pollution, it's everything else. So pretty much every body or organ is affected by air pollution. and it's a major contributor to the global burden of disease. So this is actually old, but I think it was about 2016, but 7 million people died prematurely from air pollution, both indoor and outdoor. And more than 50% of these were due to some sort of cardiovascular disease. So stroke, 20%, and more than 30% were heart related. So more than 50% of these deaths are due to cardiovascular disease. And it's not just high levels of air pollution. So even chronic low levels can increase mortality. So in Australia, this was, again, older data, but 1.6% of deaths were attributable to PM2.5 air pollution. And it's been thought of globally as an invisible killer. So if you look at heart disease, for example, air pollution can cause about 25% of, can contribute to about 25% of the deaths due to heart disease. So it's been described as the most important environmental risk factor contributing to global cardiovascular mortality and disability. And both short and long-term exposure to PM2.5 increases cardiovascular deaths and hospitalizations, heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, rhythm problems, blood pressure, and diabetes. Short-term air pollution is one of the important triggers for heart attacks globally and accounts for nearly 5% of heart attacks worldwide. And it is coals and cars that are making us sick. And interestingly, the PM2.5 from coal combustion is actually more toxic, as well as the diesel traffic than from other sources. And diesel traffic exhaust also is another preventable cause of heart attacks. And something called idling. So, just try to avoid idling your car, because that's like smoking a cigarette, and it's probably worse, because that also contributes to air pollution and you're just breathing all those particles in. So we know that wildfires are going to increase. This is a great thing. You can download it from NASA, but it shows all the fires in the world burning at different points of the year. But I just thought it was just a really great video. Anyway, so we know wildfires are becoming more frequent, but this emitted smoke dramatically increases ambient air pollution. So bushfires and hazard reduction burns expose Australians to PM2.5, which go into the respiratory system and bloodstream. The 1920 summer bushfires caused air quality to be many times the hazardous level set by the WHO. And it was estimated to have caused 417 excess deaths, more than 1,000 cardiovascular, and then more than 2,000 respiratory hospitalizations. And that was an estimate. But wildfire smoke has been associated with increased heart attacks and heart artery disease, heart failure, and rhythm problems. It's also been associated with increased cardiovascular deaths. And it's even further amplified if you have high temperatures. So the air pollution, as well as the high temperatures or heat waves, increases like their effects on mortality. And these are just some Australian data. So it increased ED emergency visits for cardiovascular disease, increases emergency ambulance calls for cardiac arrest, stroke, and chest pain, and increases heart disease deaths as well. So, and I'm just going to touch on, if we think that, whilst we're not exposed to air pollution that much, I think, what prompted me to kind of look into this a little bit more, but particularly was after those bushfires and like not being able to go out and having, like thinking, oh, we can't be breathing in, like not looking at the air pollution at the time, this can't be good for us, like anyone, not even, any patients, particularly with cardiorespiratory illnesses that I was seeing a lot at that time, but, children and, anyone at all. And so they have something called an air quality index. And if you haven't done so already, I'd advise you to download an air quality app on your phone, because this was Sydney 2 or 3 weekends ago. I think what's the date? 22nd of August. They were doing some hazard burn reductions, and I think maybe there were some fires as well. It was red, so it was unhealthy. So you shouldn't have gone out. You should avoid exercise going out. You should have worn an N95 mask when you were outdoors. The PM2.5 levels were 7 times what considered normal, 7 times the WHO guidelines. And if you look, and this is West Pymble, so I think some of you might live there. This is part of your area. This was very unhealthy at that time. And then if you look at where we were in terms of the world, we were second or third with Kabul. So this is like, even though it's short-term exposure, if you're going outside and you're exposed to these levels, and they're hazardous levels, it's not doing anyone any favors. And and this is what happens. This is going to increase cardiac deaths and other unhealthy things. And I'll just kind of briefly touch on this, but essentially, as with COVID, we know there's been a lot of mental health effects, but climate change also has a number of mental health effects as well, apart from just the PTSD and depression and suicide, which can be direct or indirect and short and long term. The reason I talk about this is that depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, all of those things also increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. It's one of the major, what we call non-traditional risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So I think that's my bit on health for the moment.
Whew.
Sorry.
Oh my gosh, again, just check your breathing, check your actually... That's an amazing set of data, Fiona. Thank you. A couple of things that leapt out at me was just that that interplay, the complex relationships between a vast number of health issues that I don't know. A lot of us don't make those dots, don't make those connections. And when we locate ourselves in ecosystems which are on fire or at risk, it's just the there's nothing linear about it. It's so complex and so interwoven. I remember having the air quality indicator app on my phone during those 2019, 2020 bushfires. A great idea to download that. I'm shocked that was just so recently, the ones you showed us. The only other thing to say is I just recently reviewed the scandal surrounding VW and their incredible deceit around the diesel emissions that they had been covering up for. It went on for years and years and years, and you heard from the guy who was meant to be looking into it, and he was kept scratching his head. This isn't making sense. And it was because that car company was willfully deceiving people, and the particulate matter 2.5 etc coming out of diesel cars across Europe and America was just off the charts. So we're pulling together all of these different threads in these conversations. Let's move to our second question now, which is, what can we do? And this is where we can start to feel like, okay, I may have some agency in this complex web of things. So how can we each do our little bit of good professionally and or in our personal lives? And we'd love to hear from you again, Lesley.
Well, thanks, Sam. The most important thing you can do is vote. And of course, that's what this Voices for Bradfield and Bradfield Conversations is all about, really. It's not the only thing you can do, but everybody over the age of 18, if half of Australia, or even not quite half of Australia, made climate policy and climate action their number one reason for voting for a candidate, we would see very, very rapid change very, very quickly. So that would be the number one. I'd say number two is move your money. Money does make the world go round. We're seeing extraordinary movement now from business, picking up on the climate risk issue. And you can go to a website like Market Forces and find out where if your bank or your superannuation company or your insurance company is investing in fossil fuels, and move your money out of that into something that's not investing. That is having a really, that sort of whole divestment push is having a huge impact. Your diet counts. One of the things that's going up in the atmosphere with CO2 is methane. And one of the things I didn't mention about the Ipcc report is that it said that methane is now basically 3/4 of the problem, or 2/3 of the problem that CO2 is for climate change. So methane is coming from sheep and cows, it's coming from some other forms of agriculture, and it's also coming from gas fracking. So, but, you know, moving towards a more plant-based diet is one way of tackling the methane problem. And I'll just mention one more because, you know, I'll leave some for Fiona to do as well. Another thing is it's really, really easy, especially when you hear talks like you just heard from Fiona and I, to feel pretty helpless and alone. And one of the antidotes for that, well, the antidote to despair is action, of course, but one of the ways to take action is to take collective action. So find a group that you relate to, be it an NGO or some sort of climate group or whatever, and join up.
Us, thank you, Lesley.
And you, definitely, Voices for Bradfield, and work collectively, because a collective voice is always going to be more powerful than an individual voice. So let me stop there and give Fiona a go.
Thanks, Lesley.
Now, do you want me to show slides or not show slides?
Go for it, by all means. Yeah.
So what I'm doing, I'm actually, the reason I'm doing this is because I did present some of this for a GP talk I did last week. So that's why I'll just show it. But hang on, I need to share my screen again. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. While you're pulling it up, Fiona, take your time. I just want to add to what Lesley said. There she is. Natalie Isaacs of 1 Million Women has a massive thing about to come out. She's been doing it for a while, but she's about to amp it up in terms of divestment. So if anybody hasn't heard of 1 Million Women and that whole divestment movement, moving where your money is, just jump onto 1 Million Women, and there's a lot of good information there. Thanks, Fiona.
Okay. So I think, I was just giving this talk, and so I thought I would just share it with you, because it was kind of like, well, you know, there's what we call cardiac benefits as well as climate change benefits. And these two things will help both your heart and the climate. So, you know, the one that Lesley talked about, the biggest one I think is like dietary changes. So plant-based diet, but just also reducing all that kind of processed and packaged food, buying local, and reducing food waste. We talk about something called active transport. I'll talk about that. Changing to renewable energy source, increased green spaces, and stopping smoking. And so agriculture actually accounts for nearly 15% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, including from ruminant livestock particularly. And that's things like beef and mutton, as well as food miles, so the transportation of food, land, soil, and water use, as well as food waste. And so this is like just a brief look at the carbon cost of different diets. So essentially having less beef is a lot better. And so having more plant-based diet is a lot better and has less carbon, has less of a carbon cost. But then there's definite evidence to show that a plant-based diet, apart from having less environmental impact, they're obviously a lot healthier. So a lot of you would probably have heard of the Mediterranean diet, which has got evidence to reduce cardiovascular disease. And it is mainly plant-based. So it's a lot of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, a bit of fish, and then very minimal red meat. And it has been shown to decrease, has been estimated to show that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and energy consumption compared with the Western diet, which actually increases all of those things. And so they did something called the Lancet Commission, and this is the picture of it. So you've got the your plate should be full of plants like fruit and vegetables and whole grains, and very little red meat. And so it just pointed out, it's like a massive document, pointed out major positive effects on both the environment as well as human health, not only just from cardiovascular disease, but cancers, diabetes, a lot of other diseases, diet-related diseases. And so if we just look at cardiovascular disease in itself, this was a paper that showed that meat, particularly processed meat, definitely increase your risk of heart disease, or what we call atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular disease in general. But then legumes, nuts, fruits, and vegetables, these all reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. And so this is what they recommend. They do something called a traffic light system, where the green is what you should be eating, moderate intake of these things, so like the dairy, and then the white meat and the eggs, and then I don't know whether it cut out on your thing, but up here it's like processed, the very processed red meats, like salami and prosciutto and that kind of thing, and then even like red meat. I try to tell most of my patients who've got high cholesterol to actually reduce their red meat at least down to less than 2 a week, and butter. And so I say to have what we call a happy heart and planet diet, follow a plant-based diet, but also you reduce your red meat intake, reduce your portion sizes, have meat-free days, have alternatives. And if you do seafood, I mean, there's quite a few environmental issues with seafood as well, but just see whether have a bit, obtain it from sustainable sources, and then just really reduce packaged and processed foods, because apart from the fact that they add stuff to it, there's lots of energy in their production, there's lots of packaging waste, and then avoid ultra processed foods. And so I just always show this because one of my patients showed it to me because he went there. There's something called Heart Attack Grill. So they have nurses are the waitresses, and then they have like a single bypass burger, double bypass burger. I think they go up to a 8 times bypass burger. They have flat liner fries that are deep fried in pure lard. They sell cigarettes and soda and things like that. So that's something you should not be having. Buy locally produced food, and not everyone can really do this. Like, I buy organic if possible, mainly because of the pesticide residues. And then reducing food waste. And I actually live in Randwick Council area. I started composting a long time ago because landfill and waste, I think Australians get rid of about more than a third of their food waste. Their waste is like food waste, sorry. So we started composting our food a while ago. This is just what we started with. But then our council area got something called FOGO, so food organics, garden organics. So they take all the our food organics, but also the grass cuttings and even like tissues, and they take it to a big composting thing. And it significantly reduces waste and uses that to make compost in like an industrial compost. And actually, I think Penrith and Randwick are the only council areas in all of Sydney that have it at the moment. So I think when we talk about what we need to do, I mean, just even local government areas, local government councils, that's all important, as well as you've got the local level and the state level and the federal level, but that's people, that's what we need to have done. So active transport, a lot of us use cars, not so much at the moment, but promoting active travel. So using a bike or walking to work, or using public transport will have general and cardiac health benefits, but it will also reduce air pollution health effects by using less cars, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And even if you can't always walk to work or cycle to work, just at least try to use your car less. It reduces obesity, and commuting by car actually increases the risk of heart attacks as well. And if you can't, if you do drive a lot and you can afford a new car, then I think electric vehicles are really the way to go and the way to go forward. I mean, unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have as many as we probably should have. Again, I think that's a government thing, but there will be cheaper ones available on the market. And when you think of how much people drive and how much emissions they're giving out, I think going electric, if you are going to get another car, is the way forward. Changing to renewable energy sources, so we know that they're bad. So changing to solar or wind, but if you can't, because some people can't put solar panels on their roofs, but there are a lot of energy companies now that only have, like the energy company we switched to only gets electricity from renewable sources. So that's important. And then increasing green spaces, so we know that they're good, but they've also been shown to reduce cardiovascular disease. They help with mental stress. They provide shade and actually help with what we call the heat urban effect, and reduce the heat island effect, sorry. And then planting trees. So planting trees is important. It reduces air pollution, and then trying to grow your own food as well. That also helps. And stopping smoking, you know, I really hope no one smokes here, but we all know that it increases your risk of heart attack. It's a cause of pollution, but it also has a number of environmental impacts. So this is, I know it's a busy, I got this actually from the internet, but essentially there's a lot of stuff used to farm tobacco. It's a land clearing and deforestation, paper used for production and pollution of each cigarette itself. And then the litter, which I really hate because I live near the beach. This was a turtle made out of 1,000 cigarettes that someone collected in less than an hour from a beach in Florida. So it is, you know, it is quite significant, the amount of smoking litter as well. So I'm just going to quickly run through this, but so reducing your personal carbon footprint, dietary changes, transport changes, walking to work, conserving your energy, so reducing how much energy you use, change to renewable energy sources, saving water, so that's also important. Reducing, so be a good sort. So I guess the waste pyramid, they call it, is reduce what you take, like reduce what you get. You know, that's everything from like buying food or clothes or everything first, and then reuse and then recycle. So yeah, so reduce first, reuse, then recycle, and then compost your food waste. And another big issue, which is another talk altogether, is about fashion and the whole fashion and how much waste goes into fashion and how it contributes as well. So reducing your fashion footprint is another way of reducing your own carbon footprint. Reducing emissions by flying less. Unfortunately, we can't fly anyway, so I don't think that's really a point. But if you do fly, and if we ever get to fly, actually carbon offsetting your flight supposedly is meant to help. And then lastly, as Lesley had said, so divest and invest. And so there are a lot of, it's not just your bank accounts, your superannuation, and your personal investments. And I think anyone, you know, if you've got a super fund at the moment, you really should be making sure that they're not investing in fossil fuels because super's not going to do well. Well, yeah. I'll stop there. Sorry, I talk a lot.
That was fantastic. What a great amount of data. Fiona, would you be okay? Like, is that available as a PDF that we could share with people, or is that something that you need to hang on to? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, no, that's fine. I can convert it. It's on a PowerPoint, so I can convert it to a PDF if you want me to email it to
That
you.
would be amazing if we can then share it with folks. Only if you're fine with that. Otherwise, they can review this video. We're recording it, and it'll be on YouTube. But there's just so much in there. I'd love to get a bit of a show of hands just while we take a breath after that. I mean, that was a fantastic amount of agency that we have that we've just been shown by Lesley and Fiona. Can we do a hands up if you, for example, compost? How many of us are composting? Yeah. Okay, great. That's giving us a feel for it. How many of you would have an electric vehicle or not have a vehicle, actually? So go with electric vehicle first. Yeah, not so many. Okay, interestingly, it's because in other countries they subsidise, you know, electric vehicles, electric bikes. So we can get into that political side of things. But there are so many of those things those areas where we could have agency, or we do have agency, but we could have a heck of a lot more if subsidies and policy was pointing in the right direction. So before I get on to our third question, which is about policy platforms, I would really love to introduce our neighbouring Voices of, which has just started up. This is very pertinent to what agency do I have. Michelle Rawson has, with a few friends and colleagues, started setting up Voices of Bennelong. So hands up anybody who's actually from the Bennelong electorate. Yeah, good. Okay. Fantastic. Michelle, are you there to just do an introduction to Voices of Bennelong?
Yeah. So
where are you? Oh, yes, there you are. Beautiful. Thank you.
I'm up here. I don't know. Great. So my name's Michelle Rawson, and I started Bennelong Climate Action Group about 12 months ago, just over 12 months ago. So we've been doing a lot of advocating for stronger climate action in Bennelong, and it's been going quite well. When I started Bennelong Climate Action Group, I think my goal was initially to lobby our federal member for stronger climate action. And I think one of the things I've come to realize is that he is, I don't think any amount of lobbying will help, and maybe this government just isn't up to the job, which has, that's just the reality. So I think it's fine to vote, vote for climate, but if you've got no one in your electorate to vote for, Bennelong is a very safe Liberal seat, so people aren't going to vote Greens, and people aren't necessarily going to vote Labor, and Labor's unlikely to put a strong candidate up. So our aim is to find out what is important to the community, because I don't think the community of Bennelong's being represented, and to advertise and hopefully find a strong candidate to run against John Alexander. And I think that candidate would have to be strong on climate, and it's one of the big issues in the electorate. So we're getting a really good team together, and it's quite exciting, and I think people are ready for change. So if anyone's from Bennelong and wants to jump on board, we'd love to have you. Yeah, or if you know a really good candidate or somebody who would be amazing, obviously all our eyes point towards Lesley.
She's shaking her head, Michelle.
But I'm sure we've got a Zally Stegel out there somewhere. I mean, Bennelong's full of highly educated people who are quite diverse and incredible. And I'd love to see. I'd love to have someone to vote for. Yeah.
Fabulous nice way to put it, and not to put any pressure on voices of Barowra. If there's anybody from Barowra out there, hands up, come on, fess up. Any Barowrans there? No, I'm not seeing a single hand. Maybe let me scan. No, well, that's part of the problem. We're very happy to help the voices of Barowra start. And just to say, I just looked at when we incorporated Voices of Bradfield. It was only in April. And so we've been going a very short amount of time, May, June, July, August. Here we are, beginning of September. We have raised a lot of money that's sitting there, and we're using it to create T-shirts and flyers, and we're postering. Many of you are here because of letterbox dropping. We have 40 plus volunteers who are doing that letterbox dropping, thanks to Stuart and Carolyn and Kate for doing the posters. Like most of the team are here tonight, and all I'm attempting to say is, in terms of agency, when you get the right little posse of people together, you can make a difference, and the momentum is really growing quickly. So thank you to Michelle for being on the same path, and Stuart's put your Facebook page in the chat so that you can get there. They haven't quite got a website up yet, but you've got Facebook page, and you're on the socials, aren't you?
Yeah, and we've got an email address as well. So we're about, we've got a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, and hopefully we're about to burst onto the scene and start making some noise and an impact in the electorate.
Yes, fantastic. And I have to say, Kathy McGowan is on the call. God bless you, Kathy McGowan. She's praising us for having started, but really you are our model. Kathy, do you want to unmute yourself and just say hello? And the Community Independence Project as a way of networking and catching up with other groups. Where are you?
Yeah, hello everybody, Kathy McGowan here. Oh, it's so exciting. I mean, horrific to hear all that stuff, but just so exciting to know what you're doing and the logic behind what you're doing. And welcome to the network all over the country. There's groups of us doing exactly the same thing. Like today, I've been speaking to a group in Durack, which is the largest electorate in Australia, like almost all of Western Australia.
Wow.
There's a group in Boothby. Boothby is in South Australia, where anyhow, Liberal Party candidate is stepping down, and it's going to be a fierce election between Labor and Liberal. And the Voices people are going to run a candidate there to make sure that their preferences, make a difference. So using all the political influence they've got. And of course, there's groups in Sydney and Melbourne and all over the place. So it's just this most magnificent network. But anyhow, if you haven't already done so, can I encourage you to sign up to the Community Independence Project? And we have regular networks, like every 2 weeks, a Zoom networking activity. So you can connect up with other groups and hear what they're doing and exchange ideas and get ideas. So really, that's really what I wanted to say. And that's enough from me. I'll turn my picture off because my internet is not strong and it will disappear if I use too much of it. But
thank you so much,
lovely.
Kathy. Kathy is like the godmother of the Voices of movement. And she has kindly agreed, thanks to Carolyn, member of our team, to launch our search for a candidate, which is happening. Stuart and Carolyn can tell me the date. It's in about a week. It's very soon. We are running so fast because we don't know when this election is going to be announced. So thank you, Kathy, for being part of that. And so that brings us beautifully into question 3. When we do have politicians with vision and who are comfortable creating long-term impactful policy, what should we be seeing? What would an excellent representative, one who's listening to their constituents' concerns, be doing for our common good, and how does that translate into policy settings? We'd love to come back to you both, Lesley and then Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I can kick off. Well, one of the first things they should be doing is supporting Zali Stegel's climate bill, which is a fantastic bill with a whole bunch of really fantastic initiatives in it, including 5-year reporting on climate targets. At the moment, it's not really going anywhere because it's not getting enough support in federal parliament, but it's there and ready to go. As I mentioned in my first talk, removing fossil fuel subsidies, halting any further coal mine expansions or coal or gas mining licenses. So moving away from, exploiting the Beetaloo Basin, the Galilee Basin, et cetera, and instead, of course, taking the opportunity of the fact that we have one of the world's best wind and solar energy resources in this country. It's free energy. If we took all that money that we are spending on fossil fuel subsidies and used that to transform the grid, and that $10 billion worth of battery storage, for example, we could transform the energy system in this country. It's a challenging thing to do, but the resources are there and the technology is there. And this notion that the government keeps pushing that we have to wait for technology rather than taxes is ridiculous. We already have the technology to make a huge difference. So they'd be my top things. Fiona also mentioned electric vehicles. I have just bought an electric vehicle. It was pretty expensive, and that's because the government makes it so. There's relatively few models. There's not a lot of charging stations being supported. But it is another example of where business is setting up. So there's a new company called Jolt that's coming in and is going to be putting in 5,000 electric charging stations. And I think once that happens, the sort of hesitancy that people have over electric vehicles will start to be eroded and we'll start to get a really big upswing. So I would think the next 5 years, we're going to see an enormous upswing in electric vehicle purchase. And of course, that goes to not only saving energy and not burning petrol, but it also goes to what Fiona was saying about air pollution. Electric vehicles, especially if I charge my car in my driveway from the solar panels on my roof, and I like to tell people that I'm now driving on sunshine. So it doesn't produce any pollution at all. And that just makes me feel good, even though actually spending the money on it was a big thing. Once you've done it, I'm hoping to keep that car for 10, 15, maybe 20 years and drive it on sunshine the whole time. I'll stop and give Fiona.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lesley.
To say about politics.
Yeah.
No, I'm just glad you said about how, I actually have to admit, I actually just bought an electric vehicle too, and I'm a bit stressed about how much I paid for it, but I was kind of because the New South Wales government was meant to give us a stamp duty and a $2,000 or $3,000 rebate back on it. That was meant to pass on 1st of September, but unfortunately hasn't passed yet, but they said they still will. So anyway, all right. So I think, as we were talking about before, it's mainly agreeing. I agree with Lesley about the things like the climate bill. The other thing, I guess, mainly from a healthcare perspective, which I haven't mentioned, Unfortunately, the healthcare sector also contributes quite a significant amount of emissions. So it accounts for, in one study, it was about 7% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. You know, if you can imagine all the power in the hospitals, but all the consumables, it's, you know, it's a significant contribution. More than half of that is due to private and public hospitals. About less than 4% is from GPs. But, you know, I think part of having a good candidate is also knowing about the healthcare effects, and being Doctors for the Environment Australia and AMA have done this thing called a healthcare sustainability unit that they kind of want the government to kind of put forward to help with Australian healthcare reducing their emissions as well. So I think that's kind of something, you know, from my perspective, that's, you know, that's something that needs to be looked at, you know, for the health of everyone, to be honest. And yeah, it's not just, and it's got a number of recommendations.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, Fiona. So as we progress Voices of Bradfield towards launching our search for a candidate, a number of extraordinary people are going to turn up. They're going to put up their hands and go, yes, I want to do this. And then we're going to have to develop some policy based on what the people of Bradfield want. So it's going to be people like Lesley, Hughes and Fiona Foo that we turn to help us, you know, create that policy. I think that's answering one of the questions potentially that's just popped up in the chat, which is where we'll now turn to those questions. One that came in earlier was from Sally Anand. So during pollution days, this is for you, Fiona, should we wear P2 masks if we have to go out for work? And she's working as a physio in community with older people and is interested to know what advice to give them about heat waves. Is it about aircon, hydration, staying indoors? Thanks, Fiona. And okay. Sally, please pipe up if you need to amend that question and I didn't get it quite right.
So with the masks, so N95 masks are the better ones for those high air pollution days, because they're the ones that can actually protect you from the PM 2.5. So ideally, if you were working outdoors, I actually would wear an N95 mask. Definitely if you're working outdoors. I mean, we try to avoid going outdoors, but if we did, we would wear one of them. In terms of heat waves, so this is going to be a big issue, and with older people and just everyone in general. So hang on, should older people at home on heat waves with fires? What? So inside, so I'm not sure about the question. So at home, you don't need to wear a mask inside the house. Was that the question? So, or what do you need to do in a heat wave?
Is Sally there? Yeah, so she's working as a physio in community with older people.
Yeah.
Sally? Yeah,
one question. Yeah, here I am. One question was, what's the advice to older people in regard to heat waves? And the other question was, if we're having like a 2019 summer of fires and there's huge amounts of smoke, should older people be wearing those N95 masks as well if they have to, say, go out to the shops or something, you know, when we're allowed to go out to the shops? So I would advise them, yes, particularly the older people, I would actually advise them not to go out, but advise them to wear an N95 mask if they do go out. The other thing to get them to do would actually to get an air filter in their house, because a lot of the outside, like on those high pollution days, the air pollution will go inside your house, no matter how good your seals are. So like getting an air filter inside the house as well. For things like heat waves, so the main things are staying cool indoors, and there's good evidence. There was quite a few articles recently published, but just using an electric fan. Air conditioning is great, but it's actually high energy costs and you can have power outages, but using an electric fan is good. The other thing I learned recently from Professor, from his name totally, but is using crushed ice in a towel around your neck. and things like that, and then just, you know, misting yourself and cooling yourself that way, and then just drinking lots of water. And then the other thing I've been telling like GPs, and I mean, their GPs know as well, but reducing some of their blood pressure medications as well. But my patients normally, I say, you know, during summer, you have to be drinking at least 2 liters of water a day, and more if you're exercising. And then, yeah, particularly with heat waves. So avoid exercising when you're like heat waves as well. So reduce how much exercise you do, you know, wear light clothing, that kind of thing. But I think, yeah, the ice, demisting yourself, like, you know, keeping yourself cool from that way, and electric fans are actually like simple things and very useful. Yeah.
Thank you so
Excellent.
much.
Yeah, great, Sally. Good question. Thank you, Fiona. Another question's come in around for you, Lesley. What should we be specifically asking for? And I know on the chat amongst the voices of groups, there's a concern that if we keep talking about 2050, we just keep pushing it out. Should we actually be talking about 2030, and what exactly is it? Half global emissions by 2030, or what would you say?
Yeah, we should absolutely be talking about 2030, because if we don't get it right by 2030, it doesn't matter what we do in 2050. That's just kicking the can down the road to something that will be unadaptable to. So as I said in my talk, the Climate Council's calculations is we need to about triple the level of ambition that we have currently for emissions reduction in Australia. So at the moment, the pledge that the Turnbull government actually took to the Paris meeting was for a 26 to 28% reduction compared to 2005 levels by 2030. We're not really on track to meet that. If we do meet it, it will come about through two things. One is COVID, because COVID's reduced emissions in Australia around about 5% because of a lowering of economic activity. But also the time that we had a price on carbon actually was under the Gillard government, that was a very effective mechanism, and it immediately started to reduce emissions. So paradoxically, if we do meet the Paris pledge that we currently have, it will actually be because it counts cumulative emissions, it will be because of a combination of COVID and the carbon tax. So we need to actually triple that level of ambition, but we also need to be putting money into transitioning coal mining communities away from coal to other sorts of jobs, just as a lot of European countries have done, for example, Spain and Germany. You know, the Spanish are now actually paying coal miners to do other things. You know, they've closed their coal mines and they're paying them to do other things. And we should stop expanding mines and giving out new licenses for either exploration or mining. We really have to move away from being fossil fuel dependent and being renewable energy dependent. And there's so many opportunities for renewables. You know, we can reinvigorate our manufacturing sector with green manufacturing based on renewable energy, and start exporting green steel and green manufactured goods, not the stuff that we're doing now. So we can also do things like export green hydrogen, and, you know, currently in the Northern Territory, people like Mike Cannon-Brookes are behind a huge project to produce renewable energy and export it via an undersea link to Singapore. So there's all of those things that provide jobs. We've got the technology already. There's a tremendous amount that Australia could be leading the world in renewable energy, not lagging behind.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lesley. And we have some speakers coming up who will be speaking to how we can decarbonise the economy in quite some detail. Any tips for overcoming the resistance to reducing meat intake? Fiona, people seem happy to discuss electric vehicles but see diet discussions as a moral judgment. Thank you. Kate, who's on our team.
I would check their cholesterol. That's how I got most people to reduce their meat intake, because I do something called a CT scan of their, often they have a CT scan of their arteries and they've got plaque in there and they can't get their cholesterol down, and they don't want to be on a statin, like a cholesterol medication. So so I go through their diet, and actually that's the first one I get them to reduce. Yeah.
Fantastic. Kate, sorry, do you want to speak? Kate? Kate is a medical doctor also. There you go.
Oh, no, I think that's very good advice. I think you have to go at it from whatever angle works. I mean, some people it's health, some people it might be environment, some people it might be animal welfare, and hopefully we can start using the risk of pandemics, because it looks like factory farming and housing sick animals close together is actually one of the biggest drivers of novel strains of influenza and other organisms. So it might be a new reason to stop eating meat.
And that's another of those examples where we're joining dots that we hadn't ever joined before in our minds and I suppose in the science. Thank you very much for that. There's a question, what's the position with coking coal? Lesley, do we still have to live with this coal to allow us to make electric cars and wind turbines?
No, look, I mean, coking coal, for those of you not into steel making, is what's used to make steel. Moving out of coking coal is more difficult than moving out of thermal coal for electricity production, basically because we've got other sources of electricity, but it's not impossible. There's a lot of research going on now into green steel making, so getting the temperatures that we need from other sources of energy. So it'll take more time and more technology, but we can move out of coking coal as well. It will be slower, however, than moving out of thermal coal. But given that thermal coal is producing a lot more emissions than coking coal, getting out of thermal coal really needs to be the top priority.
Great, thanks, Lesley. I'm going to take one more question, which I'm just looking in the chat here. Seaweed. Do you want to have a word on seaweed, Lesley?
Sure.
Added to livestock.
I can also very quickly cover the gas question as well. So yes, so there is some exciting data now available that there's a particular species of seaweed. It grows down in Tasmania in cool water, can be used to make livestock feed, and it greatly reduces the amount of methane being produced, especially in cattle. So that is, we're not going to stop people eating beef completely, because a lot of people just really, really like it, but we can actually reduce the impacts if we can produce enough of this seaweed at the scale necessary to feed all the cows that are going to be grown. So that is an exciting option. It would, however, be quicker to just stop eating beef, I think. For the gas one, should we get rid of gas cooktops and gas hot water heaters? Yes, the more gas we can get rid of and the less market for gas, the less incentive there will be for fracking and other forms of gas production and gas-fired power. So the more we can move away from gas, basically what we need to do is electrify everything, that is transport, manufacturing, electricity, buildings, electrify everything and produce that electricity from renewable energy.
Excellent, thank you. One last question here is from John Broadbent. If Australia were to try to salvage its reputation on climate change, may or may not be possible, what country should we be looking to as a world leader?
Interestingly, the UK is probably one of the leaders. Now, the UK is coming with a very different energy mix. It's got a lot of nuclear energy, but it's basically almost phased out its coal-fired power. Interestingly, Boris Johnson, however we might like to criticise him in other respects, is actually leading, is one of the, notable leaders on climate. Certainly Germany is doing some great things under Angela Merkel. They're phasing out their coal-fired power. The US under Biden is hoping for a 50% reduction of their emissions by 2030. So, most of our big trading partners and allies are actually moving in the right direction. I think that the really interesting thing at Glasgow that everybody's sort of crossing their fingers about is what China decides to do. So China is now the single largest emitter. It emits 30% of all emissions. It set a net zero target by 2060, which of course is way too late. But even if they don't come to the party, I think they probably will increase their ambition because they're trying to take that global leadership role. But even if they don't, well, 70% of emissions are coming from non-Chinese sources, and we need to get those under control.
Great, that's very clear. Basically, anywhere we look, there are other people doing better than us.
Yep.
But interestingly, also the UK, I mean, the Conservative government, but they had Margaret Thatcher who got it decades ago. So there was a seed was sown back then.
I mean, the thing
gonna
about
say
the UK, Sam, I would just say is that the real difference in the UK compared to here is that it's been a bipartisan and indeed a tripartisan approach to climate. There has not been an ideological or political divide between the major parties on climate. They might disagree on pretty much everything else, but they absolutely are at one on climate. So of course that has allowed the UK government to make great strides.
Yes, thank you. Fiona, were you going to add something there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, when you're talking about the UK, in terms of the NHS and the healthcare system, they're actually also leading the way in terms of increasing sustainability in healthcare. So yeah, looking at that, I think Australia's kind of looking at that as well in terms of healthcare sustainability.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Chris Patton here. I'd like to do a follow-up point on Leslie's topic about the seaweed. And it's an important one that I've only just realised, and nobody's ever mentioned it before, is that the methane gas from the cows and the cattle produces the climate warming. The seas warm up. The east coast current down the east coast of Australia takes the warm air down, the warm seas down to Tasmania, which is killing the seaweed, which then we can't feed to the cattle because it's dead. So we've got a perfect positive feedback loop going on at the moment.
Yeah, interesting point, Chris. I don't know what to say to that. We've got so many positive feedback loops that we've set up, and you think you've got a solution, and then you look again. So
is it the same type of seaweed though? Is it the same type of seaweed? It's the giant.
It's on the seaweed that's dying is on the east coast of Tasmania.
Yeah, the giant kelp forest.
It is the giant kelp that's dying. It's actually not the same genus as the seaweed. The seaweed that's being fed to cattle is a species of seaweed called Aspergillus, but it does still need coolish water. But at the moment it's growing quite well in Tasmania. It remains to be seen whether it continues to grow well in Tasmania in the future. But it's actually the kelp, which is a different seaweed, that's actually dying off. Yeah.
Okay. A little more hopeful than you thought, perhaps, Chris.
Thank you for that.
Great. Thanks for asking. Look, a couple of things to say as we wrap this up. I'd like to get you all out of here on time. I just want to share my screen once more with this lovely website, which I'm sure you've all been to, but just to show you around it a little bit. Can you see that fine? Yeah, okay. Basically, you folks here in the room are of a certain mind, and I don't know if it's a new mindset for you or if you've had this approach to the issues we're talking about for a long time, but it's the people who aren't in the room that we actually need to reach, on top of having you all join the community and do whatever you can if you're up for that. It's a heartfelt invitation to volunteer with us. You can see on our website there's a volunteer page. We're having a lot of fun thanks to Stuart and Carolyn and Gillian doing letterboxing. There's a survey there which many of you may have done already. They are the numbers. I can't tell you how many surveys are coming in, and that's just asking you unsolicited, what are the most important things to you, what's concerning you most, and then a few other questions beyond the unsolicited ones, so we can really narrow down what is it that the people in Bradfield are needing and wanting in terms of their representation in Canberra. And then down the bottom is this very important button called Donate. And we are so happy to take any amount of money from you. And it's all, you know, we have a secretary who is very diligent, and we've set up everything absolutely according to the Incorporated Association laws that we need to. So the bank account's all organised. We have a very good strategic plan and a process which the executive committee follows week in, week out, so that we manage things well. And basically, we're here for you to act as an organisation that will help us change government. So just unsharing now so I can see all your beaming faces again. We will send out any links that we talked about tonight. We just tend to get a few of those together, like the 1 million women sort of shifting your money and anything else that came up. Fiona's going to give us the PDF. Thank you. And I think Lesley is well published in many places. The other thing to announce is that Strong Female Lead is an extraordinary documentary. Julia Gillard's name came up as, you know, the price on carbon having a serious impact on actually reducing our carbon footprint. This is a film about Julia Gillard, Strong Female Lead. It's on SBS Sunday, the 12th. And then we're hoping, we're scrambling to find a speaker or two for the Monday the 13th, so that's a week away, to discuss that film. I've seen the shorts, and it's going to blow your mind if you have any interest in the I can't put it more nicely than the misogyny that occurs in Canberra, and why we need more female, feisty female independence in Canberra. So watch this space for some special guests coming on there. And Stuart's put the PayPal button in the chat. Thank you, Stuart. I'm just checking if there's anything else there. No, I think, look, we're a little bit ahead of the game, but I quite like that, because a few people have said to me they're exhausted. It's been a big week. Can we unmute ourselves and just thank Professor Lesley Hughes and Dr. Fiona Foo
Thank you.
time and effort tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lesley.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. And take these extra 10 minutes to do some stretches, get into your body. Just remember that you're alive and human. Pat the dog, the cat, and that we can do this together. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.